My name is Braden Burries. I am 56 years old, and I want to tell you something that took me 3 years to say out loud, and another 2 years after that to say without my voice breaking somewhere in the middle of it. I'm not a writer. I need you to understand that before anything else, because everything I'm about to say is going to be imperfect and out of order in places and probably longer than it needs to be. And I'd rather you know that up front than have you wondering why someone is telling a story this way. I don't journal. I don't keep a diary. I'm the kind of man who fixes what's broken, who shows up when he's needed, who holds things together with both hands when they start to come apart. That's what I've been my entire adult life. A holder, a fixer, a man who stayed. So understand that this doesn't come from someone with a plan or an outline. This comes from a man who has been awake for 3 nights in a row and who finally just started typing because the alternative was going back out to the garage and sitting in the dark again. And my therapist, a woman named Dr. Cheryl Oates, who I'll tell you about later, told me the garage wasn't doing me any favors. She said it in the mild, matter-of-fact way she says most things, which is part of why I listen to her. There is a coffee mug on my kitchen counter right now. It's from a gas station in Flagstaff, Arizona. It has a small crack running along the handle that I repaired myself with one of those food-safe epoxy kits, and you'd barely notice it unless you knew to look. I keep that mug because a woman I never saw again, whose last name I never learned, handed it to me through a car window in a rainstorm in Columbus, Ohio. And because of that mug, I am sitting here in this kitchen right now instead of being somewhere much darker than a kitchen. That probably doesn't make sense yet. It will. But I want you to know about the mug before I tell you about everything else, because the mug is the beginning of the real story, even though I didn't understand that for a long time. And I think if you know it's coming, you'll read everything else with the right attention. Let me start at the place that feels like the beginning, even though I understand now that the actual beginning was much earlier than I ever recognized. Buried in ordinary days I didn't think to mark. I grew up in Milford Creek, Ohio. It's a small town in the central part of the state, the kind of town that exists between the towns you've actually heard of. You could drive through it in 4 minutes on the state route that cut through the middle and never have a reason to slow down. There was a grain elevator on the edge of town that was the tallest structure for miles, and that I climbed, illegally, with my friend Danny Kale when we were 13 because Danny dared me, and I was constitutionally incapable of walking away from a dare in those years. From the top you could see so far in every direction that it felt philosophical, like the world was making an argument about itself that you couldn't quite hear the words of. My father was a sheet metal worker at a fabrication plant 2 towns over. He left before dawn most mornings and came home with his hands changed by the work in a way that was permanent, a particular roughness and density that I associated with competence long before I could have articulated why. My mother worked the front desk at a dental office 3 days a week and spent the other 4 managing a house that always smelled of pine sol and whatever was baking, 2 smells that became, for me, the smell of being safe and accounted for. We were not poor. We were not wealthy. We were the kind of family that fixed appliances instead of replacing them, that took vacations to state parks because they were free after the parking fee, that had 1 car for years and then 2 modest ones, that understood money as something you showed respect toward rather than enjoyed. My father grew up in the Depression's long shadow, born in 1938, and he carried that shadow into every financial decision he made for his entire life. We did not waste things. We did not buy what we didn't need. But we also always had what we needed, and I understand now how much work went into making that true. I learned to work with my hands because my father worked with his, and because, in the particular emotional vocabulary of my family, teaching someone a skill was an act of love. My father was not a warm man by nature, not in the way that people use warm when they mean demonstrative, when they mean easy with hugs and words and the open expression of feeling. He showed love through competence. If he taught you something, that was love. If he trusted you to stand beside him and handle a tool, that was love. If he gave you a job and didn't hover while you did it, that was the deepest form of love he had. By the time I was 12, I could change the oil in a car, fix a running toilet, replace a light switch, set a fence post in concrete, and frame a basic wall. By 16, I had helped him re-roof the house and understood the principle of load distribution in a structure. I didn't always understand the language he was speaking when he was teaching me these things. I thought, sometimes, that I wished he would just say something. Just say he was proud of me or that I'd done well. Just use the words instead of the lesson. But I came to understand the language eventually, gradually, the way you come to understand something that was always there once you've spent enough years looking at it. And I am grateful I came to it before he died, because it meant that I could tell him in the last year of his life when he was still alert and present that I knew. I said, "I know what you were telling me." He looked at me for a long moment. He said, "You turned out all right." For my father, that was a standing ovation. My mother was different, warmer in the conventional sense, easier with words and touch, a woman who made everyone feel attended to without making them feel managed. She died when I was 38, of a stroke that came without much warning and took her in 3 days, and I still miss her in a way that sits low and steady and doesn't spike anymore but never fully quiets either. She would have had something useful to say about everything that happened later. She always did. Yeah. I met Patricia Ann Donovan when I was 22 years old at a hardware store in Columbus. I had just taken a job with a construction company there, my first real job, and I was living in a one-bedroom apartment on the east side of the city that had radiators that clanged all night and a landlord named Mr. Vitelli who smelled of cigarettes and appeared to believe that the word maintenance was not in his lease agreement. The apartment was terrible, and I loved it in the way you love the first place that is only yours, that has no history you didn't put into it. Patricia was looking at paint samples in the paint aisle, holding 2 different blues up against each other in the fluorescent light in that particular way people do when they're seriously considering something, the kind of concentrated, unself-conscious attention that I found immediately interesting. She had dark hair that she wore pulled back loosely, and she was wearing a jacket that was slightly too large for her, which made her look like she'd borrowed it from someone, which she later told me she had, her brother's, because she'd left her own in a restaurant 2 weeks prior and hadn't gotten around to replacing it. She was frowning at the paint samples in a way that suggested personal offense, and I don't know exactly why I said anything, except that she was beautiful and seemed like someone who wouldn't be boring, which are the 2 qualifications I had at 22 for who I wanted to talk to. I said, "The Wedgwood blue will look greener on the wall than it does on the card." She looked at me with the particular assessment of someone who hasn't decided yet whether you're helpful or annoying. She said, "Are you a painter?" I said I was a contractor, which was not quite true yet. I was an entry-level laborer for a contractor, but it sounded better and was directionally accurate. She said, "Which one would you pick?" I said the other one, the one in her right hand, because it was the one she'd been holding longer without putting down, and in my experience people already know what they want before they ask. She looked at the card for a moment and then put the other one back on the rack. She said, "Help me carry these." I helped her carry 4 gallons of paint to her car, a dented Honda with a parking sticker from Ohio State. She asked if I was always that helpful or if I wanted something. I told her I wanted to take her to dinner. She laughed and said I was forward. I said I was efficient. She laughed again, and that laugh, open and slightly surprised. The laugh of someone who's genuinely amused rather than performing amusement was the sound that changed my life. I don't say that with any sentimentality I'm trying to perform. It just happens to be accurate. We were married 14 months later. I want to tell you who Patricia was in those early years, who she was before I have to tell you who she became, or who she revealed herself to be, or however you want to frame what happened later, because the person she was at 23 and 25 and 30 deserves to exist in this account as she was, not as a prelude to a betrayal. She was funny, sharp and observational in a way that caught you off guard because her delivery was quiet, and she'd wait until the exact right moment. She was loyal with a stubbornness that could be exhausting and was also, when it was directed at you, a kind of armor against the world. She was afraid of flying, which meant we drove everywhere in our early marriage, including a trip to Nashville once that took 2 days each way and was one of the best trips I've ever taken. She loved thunderstorms from inside a house, loved the specific safety of being warm and dry while something dramatic happened outside. She could not watch horror movies but could read true crime without flinching, a distinction I always found interesting about her. She made friends easily and kept them for years, which I think is one of the better character tests there is. She had, and this is something I want to say plainly because I think it matters, a deep and genuine interest in other people. She wanted to know about them, their lives, what they worried about, what had shaped them. I mistook this for a while, for most of our marriage actually, as a form of pure generosity. I thought it was simply that she was interested in people the way some people are interested in plants or weather patterns, naturally, freely, as an expression of who she was. I understand now, with the benefit of distance and a very good therapist and several years of honest reflection, that it was also something else, something woven together with the generosity so thoroughly that you couldn't easily separate them. It was a need to be necessary, a need to hold the keys to people's vulnerabilities, a need to be the person who knew things, who had access, who was trusted with the interior rooms of other people's lives. This made her an extraordinary friend and a complicated wife, and I don't say that as an accusation. I say it as the thing I failed to understand for 30 years, the thing that, if I had understood it earlier, might have changed how I communicated with her, might have changed what she needed to seek outside our marriage. I don't know. You can never know the counterfactual. But the woman I married was real and good, and someone I loved, and I want that to be the first thing I've said about her before anything else. Yeah. We had Marcus 3 years after the wedding. He was born on a Tuesday in February, 6 pounds 13 ounces, with a look on his face when they put him in my arms that I can only describe as already thinking about something. He looked like a person who had arrived with an agenda. He grew up to be an accountant, which I think proves something about that early expression. Lily came 2 years after Marcus. She was louder from the first day, more present, more willing to take up space. She looked like Patricia and thought like me and had Patricia's warmth and my stubbornness, and neither of us had any idea what to do with a person that complete for a while. She grew up to be a civil rights attorney. I consider her the most impressive human being I have had the privilege of knowing closely. And I say that as someone who knows her well enough to know all the ways she's difficult and difficult to love, and who finds that knowledge only deepens the impression. I was 27 when Lily was born. I was working 60-hour weeks for a general contractor and going to sleep exhausted most nights and getting up before 6 most mornings, and I was genuinely the happiest I had been in my life. I want to state that clearly and without qualification because I think in stories like this one the tendency is to retroactively color the beginning in warning shades, to suggest that the early happiness was naive or willful or built on something insufficient, and that's not what I'm trying to do. Those years were genuinely good. The tiredness was real. The being broke was real. The feeling of building something real and valuable from the foundations was also real, and it was enough, more than enough, to sustain a deep and uncomplicated happiness. We bought our first house in Westerville when Marcus was 5, a 1970s colonial with a big yard that needed substantial work and a kitchen that needed essentially everything. The previous owners had done some updates in a style that I would describe charitably as optimistic, and less charitably as what happens when you let someone who loves HGTV but has never held a trowel make decisions. The tile work in the main bathroom would have embarrassed a first-year student. But the bones were good. which is the thing that actually matters in a house. And I spent the first 2 years of owning it working on weekends and evenings and occasional vacation days, rebuilding it piece by piece while Patricia painted and chose materials and turned a house into a home that people commented on when they walked through the door. She had a gift for that, for making spaces feel inhabited in the best sense of the word, like someone was genuinely living and not just occupying. She could look at a room that I had technically completed, meaning the structural and mechanical work was right and the surfaces were clean, and identify the 4 or 5 things that would make it feel like itself: a particular lamp, a different arrangement of furniture, curtains that let in light in a way that changed the color of the walls. I was good at the bones. She was good at everything that went on top of them. We were complementary in that way, and for a long time that complementary nature felt like proof of something, like evidence that we'd chosen correctly. Yeah. By the time I was 45, I had built things that I want you to understand the scale of, because the scale of them is important for understanding what was lost and what was attempted to be taken. I had built a company. What started as me and one other guy named Terry Mims, doing residential renovations out of the back of a truck I'd bought secondhand for $4,000, had grown over 20 years into a 30-person operation called Burries & Sons, which is an optimistic name, as I said, given that Marcus showed no interest in construction and Lily became a lawyer. But I kept it because it named what I'd intended, the kind of legacy you build for people who come after you. We had contracts with several school districts, 2 hospital system renovations, a steady residential business with more referrals than we could always handle. We had a reputation for doing the work we said we'd do, on the timeline we said, for the price we agreed on, and arriving at every job site with the expectation that the people who worked for me would behave with integrity. That reputation took 20 years to build and could have been destroyed in a quarter. I had built a house, the house in Keller's Ridge that Patricia had always wanted, from the time she'd driven past that neighborhood when Marcus was in middle school and said that's where I want to be someday, in a tone that was not demanding but was absolutely clear. We moved there when Lily was in high school. I designed it with an architect named Steph Borland, who had become a friend over several collaborative projects, and I oversaw every phase of construction with an attention that was more personal than professional, and that I know frustrated some of the subs who were used to hands-off GC. But I could not watch walls go up that were going to be my walls without knowing what was in them. I built the kitchen cabinets myself, taking 3 weekends that probably should have been spent on other things. I built the staircase railing from a white oak I'd milled from a tree that had come down at a job site 2 years prior, and that I'd stored in my garage against just this kind of use. I built the back deck that looked out over the small creek, and I put a specific detail on the railing that nobody ever noticed, but that was there because I wanted it there. A notch cut at the corner posts that referenced a pattern my father had used on the fence at our house in Milford Creek. It was between me and the wood. I had built, or helped to build, 2 children into adults I could respect. That's the build I'm most proud of, the one I'm least able to take credit for, and the one whose losses later were the hardest to absorb. I had built a table, literally an actual dining table. 8 feet of solid maple on trestle legs that I made in the garage over the course of a winter when the kids were teenagers. And that became the table that the family gathered around for every significant meal for the next 15 years. Thanksgiving, Christmas, Easter, birthdays, the dinners that weren't occasions but became occasions just because everyone was there. The table is one of the things I will keep forever, regardless of where I live or what happens, because it is the most tangible expression of what I was building. That was my life at 45. Solid, load-bearing, built to last. Yeah. I need to tell you who I was at 52, because who I was at 52 is the person this story happens to, and I want you to understand him accurately before things start to change. I woke at 5:30, reliably, without an alarm. I'd been waking at 5:30 since Marcus was a toddler and Patricia, and I had gotten into the habit of rising early to have an hour before the household came to life, and I'd kept the habit long after the household stopped requiring management at that level. I made coffee, cheap drip stuff from a brand I'd been buying for years, the same brand Patricia had complained about for most of our marriage on the grounds that it was beneath us, that we could afford better. I disagreed, or I told myself I disagreed, but looking back, I think I was also just stubborn about the coffee because the coffee was mine, one of the small, uncontested territories of preference I hadn't given up. I read the news while I drank it, at the kitchen table, usually for about 20 minutes that stretched to 30 because my mind would drift from the news to whatever was on the schedule, to a problem at a job site or a conversation I needed to have or a material I'd been trying to source. I was always, in those years, thinking about three things at once. My therapist would later identify this as a coping mechanism rather than a personality trait, the mental busyness as a way of never being fully present in the room I was actually in, and I thought that was probably accurate, though I resisted it for a while. Patricia was still in bed when I left the house at 7. She woke later than me, had always woken later than me, and had developed over the years a morning routine that I knew the shape of but rarely intersected. She would be up by 8, at her desk by 9, working on things for the nonprofit from home on the mornings she didn't go in. She was good at her job there. She had a genuine talent for the fundraising and community relations aspects of it, for building the relationships that kept an arts organization funded and attended and relevant. And watching her find work she was actually good at, in her 40s, was one of the things that had made me genuinely happy for her even as other things between us were becoming complicated. The distance between us, I want to try to describe it accurately because inaccuracy would be unfair to both of us, was not dramatic. There was no single moment of rupture, no year when things clearly went wrong. It was more like a tide that recedes so slowly you don't notice the beach getting wider until one day you look and the water is very far away. We still had conversations. We still laughed at things together in the living room in the evenings. We still ate dinner together most nights. But the conversations had become, somewhere in the long middle of the marriage, more administrative than genuine. We communicated about the business of our shared life, logistics and scheduling and what Marcus had said when she talked to him, rather than about ourselves, our inner lives, the things we were thinking about or worried about or hopping for. I'm not sure when that shift happened. I suspect it happened gradually and mutually, that both of us, for different reasons, retreated from the intimacy of being truly known to the safer ground of being functional together. Functional is not nothing, but it is not what a marriage is supposed to be either. I told myself this was the long middle, the part nobody writes songs about. Every couple I knew who had been married for 30 years had some version of this, the settled companionship that was less combustion and more infrastructure. I had friends whose marriages had fallen apart precisely at this plateau, who had mistaken the quiet for emptiness and left to find something louder, and I had watched most of those departures with something close to incomprehension. The fire doesn't keep burning the same way. That's not failure, I thought. That's physics. I was right about some of that. I was wrong about enough of it to matter. Yeah. Marcus was 29 and living about 40 minutes away in Gahanna with his wife Sandra, who he'd married 2 years before. I liked Sandra from the first time I met her, which is a stronger statement than it sounds, because I am not easily won over by my children's partners. Not from protectiveness exactly, but from a baseline wariness about whether the person in question understands what they're getting, whether they have the patience and honesty and durability that a lasting partnership requires. Sandra had all of that. She was a nurse practitioner, pragmatic and warm in the particular combination those people develop, someone who had been in enough hard rooms to stop being precious about things, but had somehow kept her capacity for genuine care intact. She was good for Marcus, who tended toward anxiety and overthinking, and who needed someone who could be steady without being dismissive. Lily was 27 and living in German Village, a neighborhood in Columbus, where she was 2 years into working for a civil rights law firm that paid her roughly 60% of what she could have made elsewhere, and that she would not have traded for anything. She was in a particular kind of relationship at this point, the kind where she knew the person for several years before I ever met them, the kind she kept close until she was sure. And she was dating a man named Philip who I would eventually meet at a dinner and find immediately interesting because he argued with her and she liked it, which told me everything I needed to know about whether that was going to work. My business partner was Gerald Watts. I've said his name, and I'm going to say more about him because he requires a complete description to understand what eventually happened. I brought Gerald into the business 12 years before all of this, when the operation had grown to the point where managing the administrative and financial side alongside the field work was more than one person could do well. I'd known Gerald for a couple of years before that through professional circles, had watched him work, had seen how he operated with clients and subs, and I thought I had a clear picture of who he was. Methodical, detail-oriented, better than me at spreadsheets and projections, and the kind of systematic financial tracking that I found tedious and he seemed to find genuinely satisfying. He was also personable in the way that clients appreciated, able to take a difficult conversation and land it without drama. I trusted him. I want to be honest about the degree of it, because the degree of it is part of the story. I trusted Gerald Watts the way you trust someone you've worked alongside for 12 years, someone who has been in your house for dinner, who knows your kids by name, who you've seen behave well under pressure repeatedly over more than a decade. I trusted him as a professional and as something adjacent to a friend, not a close friend, not someone I called when things were bad, but someone in the category of person whose company I valued and whose character I thought I understood. I was 52 years old. The company was stable. The kids were launched. The house in Keller's Ridge was paid off. I was still working 60-hour weeks, but they were not the grinding, uncertain 60-hour weeks of building something. They were the productive 60-hour weeks of running something that worked. From the outside, I had done it. I had done everything I was supposed to do. I was disappearing inside it. That's not a dramatic way to put it. It's the most accurate way I know. Slowly, incrementally, over the course of years, the man I had been had become less distinguishable from the function I performed. I was less a person than a load-bearing structure. Useful, dependable, invisible in the way that all structural things are invisible until they fail. I'm not blaming anyone for that. A wall allows itself to be built around. I had participated in my own disappearance through years of telling myself that keeping things working was the same as being present, that being reliable was the same as being known, that the love I showed through doing was as legible as the love that gets said out loud. I know better now. I wish I had known better then. Yeah. In February of the year I turned 53, I had a routine physical with my doctor, Raj Mehta, who I'd been seeing for about 8 years. I'd been putting it off for 2 years, which Dr. Mehta noted with the mild, impersonal disapproval of a doctor who has had this conversation many times and has given up being surprised by it. The appointment itself was unremarkable for most of its duration. Blood work, blood pressure, the usual checklist of questions about sleep and exercise and alcohol consumption, and whether I'd noticed any changes. No, yes, occasionally no. At the end of it, after I'd gotten dressed and was sitting across the desk from Dr. Mehta, he looked at my file and said something that I've thought about many times since. He said, "You're presenting as someone under significant chronic stress. I want to talk about that." I told him I had a construction company, 2 kids, a lot going on. That seemed pretty normal, I said. He said, "Chronic stress at this level is different from being busy. Being busy is about workload. Chronic stress is about sustained activation of the stress response, often in the absence of an identifiable stressor. The body doesn't distinguish between a genuine threat and a perceived one. He asked about my sleep, about whether I felt present in my daily life or whether things had started to feel muffled. He used that word, muffled, like hearing things from underwater, he said, like being there but also not quite there. I sat in the exam room with the paper crackling on the table, and I thought about that word for a long moment. Muffled. I thought about the morning routine, the coffee, the news that I read but didn't fully retain, the job sites where I was efficient and effective and somewhere else at the same time. I thought about the dinners where Patricia and I ate in the same room and covered the same topics, and somewhere in the middle of those conversations, I would notice myself listening for the end of what was being said so I could respond, rather than actually taking in what it meant. Muffled. Dr. Maida noticed the pause. He wrote down a name and a phone number and slid it across the desk. He said, "I'd like you to make an appointment with this person. I'm not telling you something is wrong. I'm telling you that paying attention to this before something is wrong is much more productive than waiting." I took the paper. I said I would call. I put the paper in my truck center console and drove home. I didn't call for 4 months, which tells you more about me than most things I've said so far. Yeah. On the way home from that appointment, it started to rain. Not gradually, the way rain usually builds, but suddenly, the kind of rain that drops out of a low sky without much warning, hard and gray and turning the roads to mirrors. I was on the highway and then off it, stopping at a gas station just off the exit ramp because I'd been running on low for 2 days and I wanted to deal with it. There is something about almost running out of gas that I find disproportionately stressful, probably related to the same thing Dr. Maida had just told me about my nervous system. I pulled up to a pump and got out, and the rain got worse. Not dangerously worse, just worse in that way that makes continuing to stand outside feel pointless, and getting back in the car also feel pointless. I was soaked in about 30 seconds, and I just stood there because sometimes the most practical thing disappears and you're left just standing in the rain. A woman pulled up on the other side of the pump island. She was driving an old Subaru Outback, green, with a parking lot dent in the rear quarter panel and a University of Cincinnati parking sticker in the back window. She got out, looked at the rain, looked at me standing in the rain like I'd been placed there and forgotten, and she laughed. Not the laugh of someone mocking something, but the laugh of someone who finds the world genuinely funny and is sharing it. She said, "Rough day or just easily distracted?" I said, "Both, actually." She started her transaction and then went back to her driver's side door and leaned in and came back out with a gas station coffee mug. The self-serve kind, the ceramic ones that some gas stations still had with a little rack near the coffee counter. She was holding it out toward me through the rain. I said I couldn't take her coffee. She said she'd already finished it, and the mug was from the station's self-serve rack inside, and she'd been taking her time in there for 20 minutes, and they definitely had 12 of those mugs and would not miss this one. She held it out with such patient matter-of-factness that refusing it became the more awkward choice. I took it. It was lukewarm. It was much too sweet, the kind of coffee that's been sitting on a warming plate long enough to develop a particular burnt sugar quality. I stood in the rain and drank it because it seemed like the right thing to do, because she'd handed me something and walking away from it without acknowledging it felt wrong. She finished pumping, capped her tank, got back in the Subaru. As she was pulling out, she gave me a small wave through the driver's window. The kind of wave that's restrained, that doesn't commit to being a gesture, just a small acknowledgement of the thing that had happened. I watched the Subaru pull out of the station and turn left onto the access road and disappear. I stood there with an empty gas station mug, soaking wet, in rain that was already beginning to ease. I thought that was a strange and kind thing. I thought about it for a moment and then I got back in the truck. I put the mug on the passenger seat. I drove home. Patricia was on a call in the study when I got in. I could hear her voice, professional and engaged, through the closed door. I changed out of my wet clothes. I made more coffee in the kitchen, my cheap brand, in my standard mug. And then, for a reason I couldn't have explained, I reached across and picked up the gas station mug and put it on the kitchen windowsill, where a small rubber plant of Patricia's had been sitting since the plant had needed more light. The mug sat on the windowsill. I looked at it for a moment. Normal Tuesday, I went on with the evening. The first thing I noticed, in retrospect, in the long retroactive examination that happens after you understand something, was a phone call. It was 2 or 3 weeks after the doctor's appointment, a Thursday evening. I had been in the garage, not working on anything specific, just moving around, doing the kind of ambient maintenance that garages require. Patricia was in the kitchen, and I came to the garage door, which was open to the house, and stopped because something in the quality of her voice made me stop. Not the words, I couldn't quite make out the words from where I was standing. The quality, the particular register of her laugh. I know Patricia's laughs the way I know the sounds of a building. I know the laugh that's genuine and comes from somewhere, and the laugh that's performing ease, that's saying I'm fine and comfortable here when I'm not entirely. I've heard that laugh in social situations, at parties where she found someone difficult to be around. I've heard it on work calls when she was managing a donor who was being demanding. The laugh I heard from the kitchen was that laugh, the performing ease laugh. I stood in the garage doorway and listened. She finished the call. She came to the kitchen and I came in from the garage, and we made dinner together and talked about Marcus and whether he and Sandra had decided about going to Sandra's parents for Christmas and what we were going to do about the gutters on the back of the house that had been pulling away from the fascia for 2 months. Normal Thursday. I told myself I was imagining things. The second thing was a Sunday dinner. Marcus and Sandra, the 4 of us, a meal I'd made, the same kind of Sunday dinner that had been a rhythm of our life for years. I am a good cook. I've been told so often enough to believe it, and those Sunday dinners were things I took seriously, not in a performative way, but in the way of someone who considers cooking a form of care and wants to do it well. I'd made a leg of lamb that day, with a roasted garlic rub and some rosemary from the pot on the back porch, and the house smelled the way I wanted it to smell. About 45 minutes into the meal, somewhere in a conversation about something at Marcus's firm, I noticed that Marcus and Patricia were having a separate conversation. Not with words, with the small, quick, involuntary communications of eyes, the micro-expressions that people make when they're managing information in a shared space, the kind of language that exists under the verbal one, and that requires some fluency to read, but that I had spent 30 years becoming fluent in. In board rooms and job sites and client meetings, the ability to read what was happening under what was being said. I asked if something was going on. The way Marcus said no and the way Patricia asked why I was asking, those 2 responses arrived with a half-beat too much of ease, the kind that's been prepared rather than felt, and I know the difference. I let it go. I've thought many times since about why I let it go. I think the honest answer is that I was not ready to not let it go. Not yet. The house smelled like lamb and rosemary. Sandra was asking about the recipe. The wine was good. I let it go. The third thing was financial. And this is where I want to be precise, because precision is important here. About a week later, I was reviewing a quarterly summary with Gerald. We did this every 3 months, a review I genuinely valued, because it forced a systematic look at where we were rather than the anecdotal impressions I accumulated in the course of normal business. We'd been going through it for about an hour when I noticed a discrepancy. $12,000, moved from an operating account to a reserve account about 6 weeks prior. Gerald had a clear explanation. A subcontractor deposit situation, something involving the way we were holding funds related to a tax classification that needed to be handled differently than usual. He was specific and confident. The way Gerald always was when he was explaining financial things, which was one of the reasons I'd valued him for 12 years, because I trusted the confidence. It was competence confidence, not bluster confidence, or so I'd always believed. I said okay, I moved on. But that evening, lying in bed at what my phone told me was 11:45, I thought about the $12,000 again. Not in an alarm way, in a splinter way. The feeling of something small and not quite right that you can't locate precisely enough to address. I got up, went to the kitchen, made tea, which I almost never did, stood at the window looking at the backyard. The gas station mug was still on the windowsill. I picked it up and turned it in my hands, the way I turn tools I like, just feeling the weight and shape of it. There was something about the simplicity of it, the ordinary utility of it, that I found grounding at 11:45 when I couldn't sleep. A woman had handed me warmth through a rain without needing anything back. That was a simple thing, a true thing. I went back to bed. In the morning, I went to work, and the $12,000 went back to being a splinter, and the house was fine, and the routines were intact, and everything was exactly as it had been. The call from Lily came on a Tuesday in March, around 2 in the afternoon. I was on a job site in Hilliard, a school renovation that had hit a mechanical complication in the East Wing, talking to the city inspector about how we were going to address it. It was the kind of conversation that required both precision and patience, because inspectors need to be respected and not rushed, and also need to understand that I was aware of the code requirements and wasn't trying to shortcut anything, just asking for a practical path forward. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I looked down and saw Lily's name. Lily doesn't call in the middle of a workday without reason. I said to the inspector, "I need to take this, 2 minutes." I stepped away from the site, into the parking lot, into wind that was still carrying the tail end of winter. I said, "Hey, what's up?" She said, "Dad, I need to ask you something, and I need you to not get upset when I ask it." I said, "Lily, if you start a conversation that way, I am already partially upset. What is it?" She was quiet for a second, which was not characteristic of her. Lily is not someone who hesitates when she has something to say. The hesitation told me more than the words that followed. She said, "Are you and Mom okay? Like as a couple, are you actually okay?" I said yes. I said it without hesitating, the way you answer something you haven't thought about recently, but that feels like a stable fact. She said, "Okay, I've been noticing some things with Mom, and I wanted to check in." I asked what kinds of things. She said it was hard to describe specifically. She said Patricia had been saying things in recent months about feeling stuck, about having given up a version of herself, about feeling like her life had contracted into things she hadn't exactly chosen. She said she was telling me not to alarm me, but because she didn't want me to be blindsided by something she could see approaching. I asked her to say what she was trying to say. And then she said it. She said she thought Patricia might be talking to someone, romantically. She said she didn't know for certain. She said she might be completely wrong, but she'd seen some things, in the way Patricia talked about a man named Derek who she said was on the board of the nonprofit, and she'd registered something in it that she couldn't not tell me about. I stood in the school parking lot in March with the wind cutting across the asphalt, and I held the phone to my ear, and I held the image of my kitchen in my mind, Patricia at the table with coffee, the gas station mug on the windowsill, the Sunday dinner with Marcus, and the information behind his eyes. I told Lily I was glad she told me. I told her I would look into it. I finished the conversation with the inspector. I drove back to the office. I did the afternoon the way I always did the afternoon. I went home. I made dinner. I ate with Patricia, who asked about the Hilliard job, and I told her about the mechanical complication, and she said that sounded frustrating, and I said it was manageable, and we did the dishes together without much more conversation. I did not confront her. I did not ask her anything. I am not a man who acts on incomplete information. It was the discipline I'd built over 20 years of running a business, the practice of knowing what you're dealing with before you respond to it, The understanding that a premature response is often a worse outcome than waiting for clarity. That discipline was also, I recognize, sometimes a way of not having to feel what was actually happening. If I was still gathering information, I wasn't yet grieving. I wasn't yet in the terrible clarity of knowing something I couldn't unknow. I was still in the merciful imprecision of suspicion. I let myself stay there for about 2 more weeks. Then I looked. I am not going to describe every method in detail, partly because some of what I did was an invasion of privacy, and I'm not interested in defending it, and partly because the methods are beside the point. The point is what I found. Patricia had been in a relationship with Derek Hassan, a man on the board of the nonprofit where she worked, for approximately 8 months. The relationship had been physical. It was ongoing. She used her personal email and her phone in ways that felt hidden. I found the evidence on a Saturday morning in late March, sitting in my truck in the driveway of my house, looking at a screen I wouldn't have been looking at if I hadn't gone looking. I sat in the truck for a very long time. Here is the thing I want to tell you about that moment, the thing that still stops me when I think about it. I was not surprised. I need to say this accurately. I was devastated. I was in a kind of pain that was physical, genuinely physical, the way a bad diagnosis lands not in your mind but in your body, in your chest, in your stomach, and the backs of your hands. But I was not surprised. And that scared me more than the pain, because it meant some part of me had known. Had been circling this knowledge for weeks or months or longer, had been standing in the kitchen at midnight holding a gas station mug and feeling the shape of something without nomming it, and had chosen, again and again, not to look directly at it. He's always been fine. I didn't know that sentence yet. I would learn it later. But when I sat in that truck, I was sitting with the knowledge that some part of me had allowed this to get this far because I was afraid of what it would mean to look at it directly. I had stayed in the merciful imprecision not just because I was disciplined about waiting for information, but because I did not want to know. That's a hard thing to admit about yourself. It's the truth. I sat in the truck until the cold became uncomfortable. Then I went inside. Patricia was in the kitchen. I stood in the doorway and looked at her for a moment. She looked up, and there was something in my face that registered. I know because her hands went still on what she was doing. She said, "What's wrong?" I said, "I need some time to think." I went upstairs and lay on the bed in the spare room with my shoes still on and looked at the ceiling. I lay there until it got dark. Then I got up and used the bathroom and came back and lay down again. I did not sleep well for the next several nights. But I did not confront Patricia, not yet. I need to stop for a moment and tell you about Walt Heller, because Walt doesn't fit into the dramatic architecture of this story, and that's exactly why he matters. Walt had lived next door to our house in Keller's Ridge since before we moved there, which meant we'd been neighbors for about 16 years by this point. He was 74 years old, retired from a career teaching high school history. His wife Alina had died of ovarian cancer about 10 years into our neighborhood relationship, a loss that I had watched him absorb with a dignity that I found genuinely instructive. Not the repressive dignity of refusing to show grief, but the steady, honest kind that coexists with grief without trying to end it. He had a daughter in Portland who visited twice a year and called weekly, and he had his garden, which was a serious operation involving several beds and a composting situation that I'm fairly certain was more sophisticated than most commercial operations. And he had his books, and he had his porch. Walt and I had gotten into the habit, years before any of this, of drinking coffee together on Saturday mornings when the weather allowed. His porch faced east and caught the morning light at a particular angle that made the first hour of the day feel like it was offering something rather than demanding it. We talked about whatever came up, politics sometimes, history often, whatever one of us had been reading or thinking about. There was no agenda to it, no performance, no particular requirement to be interesting or productive. Two men sitting in the morning and talking, which sounds like nothing and is actually a great deal. During the weeks between Lily's call and what I eventually found, and the weeks after that when I was managing what I'd found and deciding what to do about it, I kept going to Walt's porch on Saturday mornings. I told him nothing during this period. I wasn't ready to. But I showed up, because the habit was intact, and because stopping would have required explaining why I was stopping, and because Walt's porch on a Saturday morning was one of the only places where I was not performing everything being fine. He didn't ask. Walt was not a man who asked in the sense of pressing, demanding, requiring you to surface things you weren't ready to surface. He offered presence. That's the only way I know to say it. He was present fully, without requiring you to be anything in particular in return. One Saturday in late April, somewhere in the middle of the worst of it, I was sitting on his porch not talking, and he was not talking either, and we had been like that for a while, just two people with their coffee looking at the yard. After a while, Walt said, "You remind me of how I was the year before Alina got her diagnosis, before I had a name for what was wrong. I could feel that something was off, but I didn't have the words yet." I looked at him. He said, "I'm not asking, I'm just saying I recognize it." Then he got up and refilled both our mugs and came back and asked me what I thought about a biography of Ulysses Grant he'd been reading, whether I thought the rehabilitations of Grant's historical reputation were justified or whether they overcorrected for decades of underestimation. I talked about Ulysses Grant for about 20 minutes. It was one of the better 20 minutes I had in that period. What Walt said, the 7 sentences of it, was the exact right thing, not because he solved anything or offered wisdom about my specific situation, but because he said, "I see you. I'm not going to make you explain yourself. I'm going to keep sitting here." That is a rare kind of love. It looks like nothing. It holds more weight than almost anything else. Yeah. The 3 days before I talked to Patricia were the strangest 3 days I can remember. I was in possession of knowledge I hadn't acted on yet, and there was something about that suspended state, the knowing without the confronting, that was both terrible and clarifying. I went to work. I ran meetings. I made decisions and returned calls and ate lunch and did all the ordinary things. I was very far away from all of it, doing it from behind glass, but I was doing it. On the 3rd evening, I sat at the kitchen table after Patricia had gone upstairs, and I wrote, in a legal pad I used for job site notes, what I wanted to say. Not a script, more like a map of the territory I was about to enter, the things I knew, the things I needed to know, the things I needed to make clear about what came next. I wrote it out in the methodical way I approach any complex job. What's the scope of work? What's the goal? What are the constraints? What are the steps? I went to bed that night and slept for 6 solid hours, which was more than I'd slept in 3 days, and I think it was because the decision had been made. I was no longer suspended. The conversation with Patricia happened on an afternoon when neither of us had anywhere to be. I sat her down in the living room, a deliberate choice because I wanted the space to be familiar and neutral, not the bedroom or the kitchen, and I told her what I knew. I was calm. I am not a person who raises my voice in confrontation. I find it tactically counterproductive and also just not how I operate. I was calm and I was complete and I was precise. She went very pale and then she cried. I've thought about the crying many times since, with no fixed conclusion about what it meant. I believe it was genuine. I believe she was genuinely sorry. I also believe that genuine sorry does not automatically produce genuine change, that people can be genuinely sorry for the pain they've caused and still have been the person who caused it, and that these two true things coexist without resolving. She said she had been unhappy for a long time. She said she had felt unseen, invisible inside our life together. She said that feeling was not his fault and it was not my fault, and it was something she should have addressed differently and hadn't because she was afraid of what addressing it would mean. She said she knew that none of this excused what she had done. She said she was sorry. I listened to all of it. I believed most of it. And then I said 2 things. I said, I believe you about being unhappy. I believe you about feeling invisible. I need you to hear this clearly. I have felt invisible too, for years. And I handled that invisibility by working harder and building more and making myself more useful. That's what I did with mine. That's also not an excuse for anything. It's context. And then I said, I need space, not a decision, space. She asked if that meant she should leave. I said, no, I'll take the spare room. We stay in the house for now. I'll decide what I need to decide when I've had time to decide it. She nodded. I moved into the spare room. Yeah. The financial investigation was something I began almost accidentally. In the way that you begin looking at something more carefully once your eyes have been adjusted by looking at other things more carefully. About 2 weeks after the conversation with Patricia, I was in the study late on a weeknight going through some business files I needed for a meeting, and the splinter came back. The $12,000. The explanation that had been reasonable and had also been slightly too smooth. I pulled up the business financial records and started looking with the specific attention of someone who now understood that the things he trusted might require examination. What I found over 3 evenings of careful, quiet work was not a simple theft. It was a construction. Gerald had been building something inside the business's financial architecture for approximately 18 months. A series of nested account structures and reclassifications that would, when activated at the specific moment, he intended to activate them. Allow him to transfer approximately $300,000 out of a holding account that existed under the company name into an account structure that he controlled through an LLC that was registered in a different state under a name that didn't immediately connect back to him. He had also been in communication with 2 of my major clients, not aggressively, not obviously, but building something with them. A relationship that was separate from the business relationship, the kind of groundwork that precedes a departure. Gerald was planning to leave. He was planning to take what he could carry, financially and professionally, when he went. And he had been patient about it, which was the part that was hardest to process. 18 months, while sitting across the table from me at quarterly reviews, while coming to Sunday dinners, while calling me Braden and handing me compliments about the business and my management of it. 18 months. I sat with this for several days before I did anything with it. And then, about 10 days after finding the financial situation, I found something that changed the entire shape of everything. An email chain, about a year old, between Gerald and Patricia. I want to be precise about what this was and what it wasn't. It was not a romantic correspondence. I need to say that clearly because I know how found emails between my wife and business partner sounds. It was something else, something different and in some ways harder to process. The email chain was long, covering several months. What it showed was Patricia and Gerald talking, the way people who see each other occasionally and have a mutual connection talk. The way 2 people at the edges of the same circle might find they have things in common and start having real conversations. They were sharing frustrations. Patricia about the marriage, about feeling like the person everyone needed but nobody actually saw. Gerald about the business, about feeling undervalued, about the sense that I got the credit for what he maintained. Reading it was like reading 2 people building a shared narrative, brick by brick, about being overlooked by the same person. There were practical exchanges embedded in it. Gerald had asked at one point about a specific client relationship, about something I had said about a particular contract. Patricia had told him. There were a few other instances like this, things she had heard me say at home, at dinner, in passing, the kind of thing spouses overhear for decades without cataloging as anything significant. She had put those things in emails to Gerald. I don't know whether she understood the full scope of what Gerald was building. Reading her responses with the most charitable possible interpretation, she seems like someone who was venting to someone she'd come to feel understood by, and incidentally providing context he found useful. Reading them with the less charitable interpretation, She knew enough to know she was providing something of value to someone who was in tension with me. I genuinely cannot determine which of those readings is more accurate. What I know is that she didn't tell me, and that what she provided was used. And then there was the sentence I have not been able to forget since I read it. Patricia, in a message toward the middle of the chain, when Gerald was describing what he was planning in some version of vague outline, not the specifics but the general direction, had written, "I think the kids would survive it. They have their own lives now. He has his work. He's been running on fumes for years, honestly. I think if it all fell apart he would be fine. He's always been fine." I read that sentence 4 times. He would be fine. He's always been fine. She had thought about it, had sat and turned over in her mind what would happen to me if everything collapsed, if the business was gutted from the inside, and she had concluded that I would be fine. Not good. Fine. The minimum. The floor. The thing you say about someone when you've decided not to worry about them. He's always been fine. Those 5 words told me more about how I had been perceived, how I had allowed myself to be perceived, over the course of 30 years than any confrontation or confession could have. I had been so relentlessly competent, so thoroughly functional, so completely defined by my capacity to hold things up, that the people closest to me had decided that I didn't require consideration. That things happening to me was less a concern than it would be for a person who was more visibly fragile, more openly needy, more clearly in possession of a vulnerable interior. I had built myself into infrastructure, and infrastructure doesn't need to be protected. Infrastructure just stands there and holds things up, and if it fails, and something gets rebuilt. He's always been fine. I sat in the study for a very long time. I want to tell you about the decision I made, because understanding it requires understanding who I am. I did not call Patricia into the study. I did not call Gerald. I did not confront anyone that evening or the next morning or the week that followed. I sat with what I knew, all of it, the affair, the emails, the financial construction, and I thought about it the way I think about a complex structural problem, which is to say I thought about the goal before I thought about the action. The goal was not to express how I felt. I would feel things regardless of what I did. The goal was not revenge in the loud, immediate sense, the dramatic satisfaction of watching someone understand what they'd done. That kind of satisfaction, I'd learned from watching other people pursue it, was real but brief, and often left a worse mess than the original problem. The goal was to protect what I'd built, the business and the 30 people whose livelihood was part of it, my own financial stability, the relationships that were genuinely mine with my children, with my clients, with the work itself. I called Catherine Brennan, my business attorney, on a Monday morning and asked if I could come in. I told her receptionist it was urgent. I sat in Catherine's office and told her everything, in the precise, sequenced way I'd organized it in the study over the previous few days. She was quiet for a long time when I finished. She asked several precise questions. She looked at the documentation I'd brought. Then she told me what our options were. And I told her what I wanted. I wanted to let Gerald complete the setup. Not the execution, not the actual transfer, but the completion of the structure, the point at which his intent was unambiguous and his action was legally documented. Catherine said that was risky in terms of exposure, that the window was narrow, that we would need to be certain of the timing. I said I understood. I said I wanted it done right. She said, "You're very calm about this." I said, "I'm furious. Calm and furious are not mutually exclusive." She nodded like that was the right answer. We spent 3 hours mapping it out. The weeks that followed were the strangest I've ever lived. I was in the house with Patricia, in the suspended formality of the spare room situation, and she believed, I think, that I was processing the affair in the slow, thorough way of someone who had been blindsided. She was giving me space. She was being careful. She was, in her way, being kind, the way people are kind when they're guilty and waiting. I was letting her believe what she believed. I went to work. I ran the business. I sat across from Gerald twice a week in our standing meetings and talked about schedules and materials and client relationships and quarterly projections. And Gerald was Gerald, professional and competent and confident. The Gerald I'd trusted for 12 years. And underneath the surface of those conversations, he was building his exit, and I was watching him build it with the specific attention of someone who knows exactly what they're looking at. I am not a person who is comfortable with performance. It goes against something fundamental in how I operate. I spent those weeks in a state of sustained internal tension that I can only describe as the feeling of holding something very heavy in a very difficult position, requiring constant attention and effort, unable to put it down until the moment was right. I went to Waltz on Saturdays. I said nothing about any of it. I went to Dr. Oates for the first time in mid-April. I had finally called the number Dr. Maida had given me, and her receptionist had put me in for a Thursday at 4. I sat in her office, which had a quality of lived-in warmth that I found immediately easier to be in than I expected, and I told her everything. Not what I was doing about it, not the legal strategy, but the facts of what had happened and what I had found. I talked for a long time without much interruption. When I finished, she said, "How long have you been carrying things this way?" I said, "Which things?" She said, "The ones you carry alone because you believe it's your job to carry them." I thought about that for a moment, then I said, "A long time." She said, "That's what I'd like to work on." I went back every Thursday after that. Yeah. I want to tell you about a Sunday dinner in April, one of the last Sunday dinners at the house in Keller's Ridge, though I didn't know that at the time. Marcus and Sandra came. Lily was not able to come, a work conflict. Patricia and I were still in the house together in the careful and exhausting performance of daily normalcy. I cooked. I made pasta from scratch. The kind that takes most of the afternoon and fills the kitchen with the smell of flour and something simmering, and that I cooked in the early years of the marriage when we had less money and more time, and the cooking was itself a form of celebration. I made it that Sunday because I needed something to do with my hands, needed the specific physical absorption of working with dough and sauce, needed my body to be doing a thing my mind could float above. Marcus arrived and was warmer than he'd been in recent visits, not suspiciously warmer but genuinely so, and I thought about Lily's call and about what Marcus did and did not know, and I kept working at the pasta and let the warmth be what it was. We ate. The food was good. Sandra asked about the recipe, which she always asked, and I told her what she always wanted to know about it. We talked about Sandra's work, about a patient situation she was navigating that was complex without being describable in detail, about the particular satisfactions and frustrations of her job. We talked about a trip Marcus wanted to take, to Portugal, which Sandra had been to and Marcus had not. And the conversation about Portugal was the kind of conversation that makes an ordinary evening feel like an evening. About an hour into the meal, after the pasta and before whatever I'd made for dessert, there was a lull. And in the lull, I looked around the table at the 3 people eating with me and I thought, I have built this. This table, this room, these people sitting around it. I built every piece of it. And some of what I built was wrong in ways I didn't understand until now, built on pretenses and suppressions and the daily accumulation of things not said. And some of what I built is being dismantled from the inside by people I trusted. And some of it is still exactly what it was supposed to be, real and warm and worth having. I thought, I am going to lose this house. I am going to lose the shape of this life, and I'm going to be okay. He's always been fine. I was going to be better than fine, actually, but I didn't know that yet. Yeah. The meeting in Gerald's office happened on a Tuesday in May. Catherine arrived before I did and set up in the conference room with the 2 other people she'd brought. One of them, a forensic accountant named George Chen, who had spent most of his career, untangling exactly this kind of deliberately complicated financial situation. The other a colleague of Catharine's who was there for documentation. I arrived at 9, when Gerald and I had a standing weekly meeting. He came into the conference room expecting me and found Catherine and George and the colleague, and a very organized stack of documentation on the table and me sitting at the head of it. He stopped in the doorway. I said, "Come in, sit down, Gerald." He sat down. He went through several stages in the next few minutes. I watched them pass across his face in a sequence that I recognized: denial, calculation, assessment of exits, resignation. He'd been found completely. He knew it. The documentation George had assembled was comprehensive, covering every transaction, every account, every client communication over 18 months, laid out in a sequence that told the story with no room for alternate interpretation. Gerald said, "How long have you known?" I said, "Long enough." He said, "You let me," and stopped. I said, "I needed it documented. I needed the structure complete so the legal exposure was unambiguous. I'm not interested in a messy fight that costs the company and the employees who didn't do anything wrong." I laid out the terms. He would sign a departure agreement that formalized his exit with zero equity, that included a full acknowledgement of his actions, and that waived his right to pursue any claims against the company. In return, I would not pursue criminal charges for the financial fraud, and I would not contact the clients he had been cultivating toward their eventual separate relationship with him. He said, "And if I don't sign?" I said, "Then we pursue criminal charges and George's documentation is what the DA sees." He signed by 4 o'clock. I walked out of the building at 4:15 and sat in the parking lot of my own company for a while. The light was the particular gold of Ohio in late May, slanted and warm, the kind of light that makes everything look more significant than it is. I didn't feel triumphant. I'd expected to feel something larger, and I felt instead wrung out and tired and sad in the specific way you feel sad when you understand that something you trusted was a construction the whole time. That the man you'd known for 12 years had been building an exit for 18 months while shaking your hand. I thought about the gas station in the rain. I thought about a woman asking if I was having a rough day or just easily distracted. I thought about both and thought, yes, that's still the right answer. Both. I drove home. Marcus's part in all of this was the thing that took me the longest to come to terms with, and I want to give it the time it deserves. About a month after Gerald's departure, Lily called me. She had something she needed to tell me about Marcus, she said, and she'd been sitting with whether to tell me for several weeks and had decided she had to. She had known I was dealing with a great deal and she hadn't wanted to add to it, and she was sorry about the timing. What she told me was that Marcus had known about the affair. Not everything, not the details or the extent of it, but he had known that Patricia was involved with someone. He had found out from Sandra, who Patricia had confided in. He had known before I had, and he had not told me. He had been one of the people around that Sunday dinner table managing information. I sat in the apartment. I had moved by then and held the phone and let that land. I want to describe what I felt accurately, because I think the honest description of it is more useful than a sanitized one. It was not primarily anger. It was a kind of grief with complexity in it. The grief of understanding that my son had looked at me across a table and chosen to protect a structure over telling me the truth. He had calculated, the way people do when they're afraid, that keeping the family intact was worth more than my knowing what was happening inside it. He had decided, like his mother, that I would be fine, that the structure was worth more than my actual knowledge of it. I called Marcus. We talked for a long time. He cried, which is something Marcus rarely does, which I took as a sign of the genuineness of the remorse. He said he had been afraid of what telling me would do to me, to the family, to Christmas, to everything the table represented. He said he knew that wasn't enough, and he was right that it wasn't enough, but I believed him that it was real. I said, Marcus, I'm not going to be angry at you for this. I'm going to tell you something instead. He was quiet. I said, what you did was protect the appearance of the family over the reality of the family. And I need you to understand that I've been doing the same thing for 30 years. We built a family that was very good at looking right. And some of what was underneath was real and some of it was maintenance. And we didn't teach each other to tell the difference. That's on all of us, including me. He said, Dad. I said, I'm not done. I need you to hear this. I am not interested anymore in a family that looks right. I am interested in a family that is honest. That means harder conversations and possibly messier Christmases and a table that doesn't always look the way it did in Keller's Ridge. Can you do that? He said yes. I said, okay, then let's start over. I'll talk to you next week. I hung up and sat for a while in the apartment that was mine, that had no history of someone else's choices in the walls, and I thought about what I'd said to my son. I thought it was possibly the most honest conversation I'd had with him in 15 years. And that was a loss, all those years of less honest conversation, and it was also a beginning. The months that followed the separation, after Patricia and I had the final conversation and made the final decision, and the house went on the market and life broke apart into its new configuration, were hard in the sustained, unglamorous way that loss is hard. Not hard the way a crisis is hard, with its adrenaline and urgency and the perverse focus that emerges when things are clearly catastrophic. Hard in the way that ordinary mornings are hard when they're in a different room in a different house, and you reach for the same habits, and they're not quite where you left them. Hard in the way that cooking for one is hard not because you can't do it, but because the table is silent in a way it wasn't before. Hard in the way that there is no one to tell things to. I rented an apartment about 20 minutes from the business. Second floor, 2 bedrooms that I intended to use as a bedroom and a study, but that became a bedroom and a room where I put the things I wasn't sure what to do with yet. The boxes of books and papers, and the things you accumulate over 30 years that don't fit in a smaller space. The apartment had nothing in it when I moved in. I painted every room myself in the first weekend, not because the colors needed changing, they were a fine and inoffensive beige, but because I needed to do something with my hands, and because paint makes a place yours in a way that cleaning someone else's color doesn't. I bought furniture. I made decisions about what I wanted in a space that was mine, decisions I'd been deferring for so long that making them felt strange and then felt right. I bought a kitchen table that was smaller than anything I'd owned in 30 years, and that I chose specifically because it had exactly 2 chairs and was not trying to be anything it wasn't. I put the gas station mug on the kitchen windowsill. I kept going to Dr. Oates on Thursdays. She and I were doing something in those sessions that I initially didn't have a language for, and that I now describe as dismantling the architecture of pretending to be fine. Identifying the specific places where I had decided that being functional was the same as being present. The decades of showing love through doing rather than saying, through building rather than inhabiting. The performance of capability that had made me invisible to the people inside my own life, including, honestly, to myself. She said once, "The wall metaphor you keep using is interesting. You don't describe yourself as hidden. You describe yourself as structural, like you're not behind something but inside something." I thought about that for a while. I said, I think I became the house instead of the person living in it. She wrote something down. She often wrote things down, and I always wondered what she was writing, and I've never asked. I want to tell you about the letter. In January, about 6 months after the separation, I received a piece of mail at my business address. Handwritten on the envelope, my name and the business address, no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed, no signature. It said, "I don't know if you know this, and I don't know if it will help or change anything, but I think someone should tell you. The timeline you probably found is misleading. Patricia ended the physical relationship with Derek Hassan in the same month it started. What continued for the months after that was emotional communication, not appropriate for a married person, but not what you likely believe it was. I'm not trying to defend her actions or undo anything. I'm telling you because you seem like someone who deserves accurate information, and because I think it matters that you know the full truth rather than the version the evidence suggests. I hope you and your family find your way through this. No signature, no return address. I read this letter several times, and then set it on my kitchen table and made coffee and sat with it. I'm going to tell you how I verified it. Not the specific method, but the fact that I did. There were people who would have known the actual timeline, people close enough to Patricia and Derek Hassan to have access to accurate information rather than the documented trail I'd found. I made some careful inquiries. What the letter said checked out. The physical relationship had been brief. The 8 months of documented communication was what it said in the letter, emotional correspondence, too intimate for a married person, but not what I'd believed it to be for the 6 months since I'd found it. I sat with this. What it changed, the size of the thing, the weight of the specific betrayal. The Patricia I had been carrying in my mind for 6 months was someone who had had an 8-month affair, and that person was harder than the person the letter described. The letter described someone who had made a bad choice for a month, and then spent the following months in an emotional entanglement that was wrong but different, meaningfully different from what I'd thought. What it didn't change, the choice to pursue that connection instead of bringing her unhappiness home. The emails to Gerald, the things she'd said, the season of managed information. Those remained what they were. The shape of the marriage, the 30 years of building something that looked right, the mutual invisibility, the wall that had been constructed with both our hands. Those remained what they were. What had changed was what I was carrying about her. I called Patricia on a Sunday afternoon. She picked up cautiously. I told her about the letter. There was a long silence. She said, "Who sent it?" I said, "I don't know." She said, "Does it change anything for you?" She stopped. I said, "It changes how I feel about you. It doesn't change the decision we've made." She was quiet. I said, "I've been angry at you for a longer and larger betrayal than the one you actually committed. I want to be accurate about that. I want to tell you I know the difference." She cried. I sat with the phone and let her, not uncomfortably, just honestly. And then we talked, for about an hour and a half. An honest conversation about the marriage, real honesty, the kind that requires both people to put down the version of the story that makes them the sympathetic party and look at what was actually there. Patricia talked about feeling unseen in a way I was now able to hear differently, not as an accusation, but as the truth of her experience. I talked about feeling structural in a way she heard, I think, for the first time. We talked about the things we'd each been afraid to say for years, and had wrapped in the performance of a functioning marriage, until the performance was most of what was left. It was not a reconciliation. Neither of us was interested in that, or in pretending to be. But it was something better than what we'd had for a long time. It was two people finally talking to each other honestly about something real, and doing it without trying to win. At the end of the conversation, Patricia said, "I want you to be happy, Braden. I think I stopped wanting that for a while, not consciously, but I stopped attending to it. I'm sorry for that." I said, "I think I stopped attending to myself. That's on me." She said, "That's probably both of us." I agreed that it was probably both of us. We said good night. I sat in the kitchen for a while after in the quiet of the apartment, and I thought about who sent the letter. I have my guesses. Sandra is one of them, Sandra who knew the actual timeline because Patricia had told her, and who is exactly the kind of person who would decide in her quiet, pragmatic way that someone deserved the truth, and then provide it without needing credit for it. I've never asked. I've decided I'm comfortable not knowing. The kindness in that letter, the anonymous precision of it, the decision to provide truth to someone who deserved it at no gain to the provider, reminded me of something. It reminded me of a woman in a rainstorm, handing me warmth through a car window and asking for nothing back. Different scale, different consequence, same quality. There are people who give things without needing anything back. They exist in your life and you don't always see them clearly because they're not performing their generosity, it's not staged for your recognition. But they're there. The woman at the gas station, whoever sent the letter, Walt on his porch on Saturday mornings, Lily calling in March because she was worried and wasn't going to pretend she wasn't. Those people kept me in the world through a very hard period. I want to say that clearly. My birthday in March of the following year. I turned 54 at a restaurant in Columbus, a small dinner, Lily and Marcus and Sandra. The first birthday in 30 years without Patricia. I want to describe this dinner accurately because I think it says something true about how things actually heal, which is not through dramatic moments of clarity, but through the accumulation of small, real moments. The way a bone heals, not in a single event but in the slow biological work of time and use. Lily had organized it. She'd picked the restaurant, a place she knew I'd like, Italian, good pasta, the kind of unpretentious room where the food is the whole point. We arrived at 7, all 4 of us, and sat down, and for the first 20 minutes I was aware of Patricia's absence at the table in the way you're aware of a piece of furniture that's been moved, the space where it was still somehow occupied by its not being there. And then Marcus ordered wine and asked the server a question about the grapes in a way that was so characteristically Marcus. So specifically the Marcus I'd known since he was a child who wanted to know how every machine worked, that I laughed. A real laugh, not a polite one. And Sandra laughed. And Lily rolled her eyes in the fond, specific way she rolls her eyes at her brother, and the absence at the table became a context rather than a wound. Patricia had been part of our history. She was not at this dinner. Both those things were true and neither was catastrophic. We talked about Portugal, which Marcus and Sandra had now actually gone to, and about which Marcus had extensive and enthusiastic opinions about the pastries. We talked about a case Lily was working, the housing discrimination case that had been going for 2 years and was finally in trial. We talked about the business, which I was running now without Gerald and with Renata Cho, who had proven to be exactly the operations manager I needed. Better than Gerald in several respects, including the one that most mattered, which was that her loyalty was not contingent on her having an exit plan. Toward the end of the meal, after dessert, Marcus raised his glass and said, "To Dad, who is still here and doesn't get enough credit for being still here." Lily rolled her eyes again at the speech quality of it, but she raised her glass. Sandra said, "To Braden, genuinely." I held my glass and looked at my children and my daughter-in-law and I thought, I built this. Not the way I used to think about building things, not structurally. I built this in the organic, imperfect, uncontrolled way that relationships are built, through presence and failure and repair and honesty and showing up again after the showing up gets hard. And what it became is something I can sit with, something I can actually feel, rather than just maintain. I said thank you, all of you. We drank. I want to tell you about the drive in April, the one I went on without a destination. It was a Saturday. Walt and I had had our usual coffee and our usual conversation, which that morning had been about the particular historiographical question of whether contingency or structure does more explanatory work in understanding major historical events, which is the kind of thing Walt and I could spend 45 minutes on with genuine interest and no resolution. I left his porch feeling something I identified, after a moment, as okay. Not fine in the performance sense, actually okay. I got in my truck and drove northwest. I don't know exactly why. Something about the morning and the conversation and the quality of the April light, the particular gold of it, the way Ohio in spring looks like it's been turned on again after a long off period. I drove through suburbs and then through small towns, and then through the flat agricultural middle of Indiana, where the land spreads out in every direction with the impassive permanence of something that has no interest in what you're going through. I drove for days. Ohio into Indiana, into Illinois, into Iowa, into Nebraska. I stayed in motels that were clean and forgettable, and that I was grateful for in the specific way you're grateful for things that do exactly what they're supposed to do. I ate in diners where I sat at the counter and ordered what looked like what the diner was good at and watched the kitchen do its work. I stopped when something looked interesting. I kept driving when nothing did. On the third day, I was in western Nebraska, where the land opens up into the high plains and the sky becomes something you have to adjust your concept of sky to accommodate. There is a specific quality to that landscape, a scale to it that clarifies things by making you understand exactly how large the world is, and therefore how much space there is in it, that I found I needed without knowing I needed. I pulled off at a gas station outside Ogallala. I filled the tank and went inside, and they had a rack of those ceramic self-serve mugs near the coffee counter. I filled a cup with gas station coffee, too sweet the same as always, and took it outside and sat on the hood of my truck and drank it looking out at the plains. I thought about a gas station in Columbus, Ohio, a woman in a green Subaru in the rain who had asked if I was having a rough day or just easily distracted. Both, I had told her. Both. I had been telling the truth in that moment without knowing how much truth I was telling. I had been having the beginning of the worst years of my adult life, and I had been easily distracted by the construction of my own life, distracted by the structures I'd built until I couldn't see what was happening inside them. Both those things were true. I thought about the mug on my windowsill, the Flagstaff ponderosa pine, the crack I'd repaired. I took a picture of the Nebraska horizon, wide and flat and impossibly large. I sent it to Lily. She sent a question mark. I sent back just driving. She sent a heart. I finished the coffee. I went inside and rinsed the mug in the bathroom and put it back on the counter. I got in the truck and drove another 150 miles and then pulled into a motel outside a small town called Kazed and slept for 8 hours without waking. In the morning, I turned east and drove home. Yeah. I'm 56 years old now, and I want to tell you what I know, the actual things I know, the ones that cost something to learn, because I think the point of telling a story like this one is to arrive somewhere true. I know that staying by itself is not a virtue. I believed for a very long time that enduring, persisting, being the one who stayed no matter what, was a form of love and character. I understand now that staying can be love and can be avoidance and can be both simultaneously, and that the distinction matters. I was staying in a marriage whose interior had become something I wasn't looking at because looking was harder than staying. I was staying in a version of myself that worked for everyone except the person living it. I know that being reliable is not the same as being present. I was reliable in every practical sense for 30 years. I was not consistently present. There is a difference between being someone people can count on and being someone people actually see, and I spent too long thinking they were the same thing. I know that infrastructure does not announce when it needs maintenance. I built myself into a load-bearing function and then didn't tell anyone, including myself, that the function was costing me something, that the person performing it was tired, that the wall had a hairline crack that needed attention. I let the crack go unattended for years and told myself it was settling, that it was normal, that structures always made sounds when the weight shifted. I know that betrayal grows in the spaces you leave. This is not a way of saying Patricia's choices were my fault, or that what Gerald did was my responsibility, or that Marcus's silence was anything other than his own fear-driven decision. It's a way of saying that the spaces existed because I had helped to create them, had maintained certain distances and silences and performances that left room for things to develop that might not have developed if I had been more honest about myself sooner. I know that some kindnesses are enormous, and you understand their size only backward, Only when you have enough perspective to trace the line from a small, warm gesture to the moment where you are actually okay because of it. A woman handed me warmth through a rain without needing anything back, and I carried that mug through 3 residences and every hard morning of the last 4 years, and it is still on my windowsill. And some mornings it's the first thing I look at, and some mornings it's enough. I know that the people who show up without drama matter more than almost anything. Walt on his porch, Lily making a phone call in March because she was worried, Sandra who may have sent an anonymous letter because someone deserved the truth, Marcus, slow and imperfect and genuinely trying to be different, which counts. These people did not save me in any dramatic sense. They just stayed in contact with me when the structure was failing, and that contact was what kept me from losing myself entirely in the failure. I know that you can love someone completely and honestly and still have the marriage be the wrong shape. This was the hardest thing to learn and the most important. I loved Patricia for 30 years, and some of that love was real and generous, and some of it was the love of the function for the thing it held up, and I couldn't always tell the difference, and neither could she. That complexity doesn't erase the love, but it does mean that the ending of the marriage was not only a loss, it was also a clarification. A correction of shape. I know that I am not a wall. I am a 56-year-old man with a cracked and repaired gas station mug, and a cheap drip coffee maker, and a therapist I look forward to seeing, and a daughter who calls when things happen, and a son who is learning honesty, the way we all learn the things we were never taught, slowly and imperfectly with some backsliding and some genuine progress. I have a neighbor who has never once asked me to explain myself, and has given me the enormous gift of just sitting next to me for years. And I have a company that is in better shape than it's been in 15 years, because the person who was quietly draining it is gone, and the thing that was being drained can breathe now. I have mornings. I run in them, badly and without commitment to improvement, but I run, and something about moving through the air in the early part of the day helps. I read. I sit on my small deck on evenings in the better months, and I watch whatever the neighborhood is doing, and I don't explain myself to anyone. I am not fine in the way I used to be fine. Fine was a performance. Fine was the answer you give when the truth would complicate things. Fine was he's always been fine, spoken by someone who had stopped attending to weather that was actually true. I am something better than fine. I am actually okay, which requires knowing the difference, and I know the difference now. Yeah. One last thing, a genuinely small thing. The mug from Flagstaff, the gas station mug with the ponderosa pine. I've told you about the crack. The handle crack I repaired with food-safe epoxy about 1.5 years ago, after it fell from my windowsill during a windstorm that came through an open window I'd forgotten to close when the weather turned. The handle nearly came completely off. I caught it on the floor before it broke further, but the damage was real and I couldn't just leave it. I repaired it the way I repair things, carefully, with attention, using the right material for the job, letting it cure properly, checking the bond before putting it back into use. If you held the mug and ran your thumb along the handle, you would feel something, a slight ridge where the repair is, a trace of what happened. But you would not question the mug. It holds what it holds. It does what it does. I use it every morning. The cheap drip coffee, the same brand, in the mug with the Flagstaff ponderosa pine and the hairline repair, and the memory of a stranger's uncomplicated generosity on an ordinary Tuesday that turned out not to be ordinary. Every morning. Both, I told her. Rough day and easily distracted, both. That was the most honest answer I'd given anyone in a very long time, and I gave it to a stranger in a rainstorm who asked me a question and didn't need me to be any particular answer. I'm trying to live that way now, to answer honestly when someone asks, to ask honestly when I want to know, to not perform the load-bearing and to let the load-bearing be what it is, structure, useful, honest, and to also be the person who lives in the house, with a mug and a crack and a repair and a morning that is mine. I'm trying. That's all I've got. Yeah. I've been sitting here for another hour and I realize there are things I skipped because they felt secondary. But they're not secondary. They're the texture of what actually happened. And if I'm going to tell this honestly, I have to include them. Let me go back to the summer before everything broke open. The summer I was 52. The summer that felt entirely normal and that I now understand was the last summer of a version of my life that was finished without yet knowing it was finished. That summer I took 2 weeks off, the longest vacation I had taken in probably 6 years. The company was stable enough to manage without me for 2 weeks. Gerald was more than competent at the day-to-day, and Catharine had been telling me for a couple of years that I needed to stop treating vacation as a concept I agreed with in principle and then never actually implemented. So I took the 2 weeks. Patricia and I drove to Maine, which was something she had always wanted to do, and which I had been glad to do because driving is something I genuinely enjoy. The sustained forward motion of it. The way a long drive lets the mind process things without requiring any particular output. Maine in July is a specific thing. I want to describe it because I think about those 2 weeks more than I expected to, and I think about them as both beautiful and as a kind of evidence I didn't know I was gathering. The coast is rocky and gray-green, and the light has a quality I don't have a precise word for, a clarity without brightness, like things are being seen exactly as they are. We stayed in a rental house outside of Rockport, a weathered cape that sat back from the water on a small rise and had a porch that looked east toward the ocean. The first 3 or 4 days were good. The driving had done what driving does, cleared the static, and Patricia and I were easier together away from the house and the routines, the way people sometimes are when the context changes and they remember how to be themselves rather than their roles. We ate well, the seafood the way it should be, simple and fresh. We walked on rocky coastline in the mornings and sat on the porch in the evenings. We had conversations that were more personal than our Columbus conversations, less administrative, closer to the conversations we'd had in the early years. I noticed that and was glad of it. Around the middle of the first week, something shifted. Not dramatically, just a quality change, like a room that's lost a few degrees and you're not quite cold but you're not quite comfortable anymore. Patricia was on her phone more. Not aggressively, not obviously, but more than felt like it was about the nonprofit or family logistics. She would drift away from a conversation in the middle of it. In a way, I attributed to the mental vacation from work being harder for her than for me, because she carried more of the relational work of her job inside herself. I didn't say anything. This is the part I need to be honest about. I noticed something and I didn't say anything, and the reason I didn't is complicated and also simple. The complicated part is that I wasn't sure what I was noticing, and I don't like to speak imprecisely about things I'm not sure of. The simple part is that the conversation felt like one that would change things, and I didn't want to change things in the middle of Maine in July when the evenings on the porch were good, and the seafood was good, and we were closer than we'd been in months. That's a choice. I want to name it as a choice. I chose the evening rather than the truth, which is something I did more times than I want to count over the years, and which is part of what I meant earlier when I said the spaces existed because I had helped to create them. On the last night in Maine, we had a dinner that I cooked in the rental kitchen, a lobster that I'd bought from a dock that morning, simple preparation, drawn butter, bread from a bakery in Rockport. We ate on the porch as the sun went down over the land behind us, and the water in front of us went from green to gray to the particular dark blue of a summer evening that hasn't gotten cold yet. We drank wine, a bottle Patricia had found at a local shop that was better than I expected. Patricia said, "I don't want to go home." I said, "We can do this again. We could do it every summer if we made the decision." She said, "I don't just mean Maine." I looked at her. She said, "I mean I don't want to go back to the way things are." I said, "Then we should talk about that." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I know, I'm just not ready to talk about it yet." I said, "Okay, when you're ready." She said, "Thank you." We finished the wine, we went inside, we went to bed. We never had that conversation. By the time I would have been ready to have it, the shape of things had changed, and the conversation we needed was different from the one she'd been alluding to on that porch. I've thought about that evening many times. I've thought, if one of us had been braver that night or earlier, if the conversations that we each knew were waiting had been had instead of deferred, would things have gone differently? I don't know. I genuinely don't know. Probably some things. Not everything. The wall had been built by both of us over many years, and it doesn't come down in a single evening, however honest the evening is. But I've kept that dinner in Maine in the category of things that were real. The water going from green to gray to dark blue. The lobster and the bread and the bottle of wine that was better than expected. The woman I loved saying she didn't want to go back to the way things were, and meaning something true by it, even if the truth was more complicated than either of us could have handled in that moment. That was real. I'm keeping it. Yeah. I want to tell you about the day the house sold. I had already moved into the apartment by then. The house had been on the market for about 6 weeks, and the market in that area was strong, which meant we had multiple offers, and the whole thing was resolved faster than I'd expected, faster than I was entirely ready for. The house sold to a family, a couple with 2 young children, and apparently a plan to do some updates that I tried not to think about too carefully. Not because the updates would be wrong, but because the kitchen cabinets were mine, and the staircase railing was mine, and the back deck with the notch at the corner posts was mine, and I wasn't entirely ready to hand all of that over to someone else's life yet. I went to the house one last time, the day before the closing, to walk through it and make sure we hadn't left anything, and to say whatever kind of goodbye you say to a place. Patricia had already been through. She'd left the key in the lockbox the realtor had set up. I let myself in with a key I'd carry until the morning of the closing and then surrender, and I walked through the rooms. The house was empty the way houses are empty when all the furniture is gone, which is to say more voluminously empty than you expect, the rooms larger and louder, every footstep saying something about the floor and the ceiling. I walked through the kitchen first. The cabinets were still beautiful. Whoever redoes them is going to have to work hard to do better. I walked through the living room.